Welcome to Newsbeacon, your trusted source for breaking headlines, global insights, and sharp analysis from around the world. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. The year 2025 marked a seismic test for the global economy, a moment when the interconnectedness of nations was put under extraordinary strain. As the world emerged from a period of relative stability, new tensions began to simmer beneath the surface, threatening to upend decades of economic progress and cooperation. At the heart of this turmoil were the United States and China, two economic giants whose rivalry had been building for years. In 2025, their competition erupted into a fierce trade war, sending ripples through every corner of the globe. The world watched as tariffs were announced, retaliated and escalated, with each side determined to defend its interests. What began as a campaign promise to protect American industry quickly spiraled into a sweeping conflict. Tariffs and countermeasures were imposed at a dizzying pace, reshaping the very foundations of global commerce. Factories slowed or halted production, supply chains were thrown into chaos, and uncertainty gripped markets from New York to Shanghai. The Trump administration's bold strategy was rooted in a belief that economic pressure could force China to the negotiating table. The goal was clear: reverse decades of trade imbalance, protect intellectual property, and bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil. Supporters hailed it as a necessary correction, a way to level the playing field and restore American strength. But this approach underestimated the complexity of global supply chains and the resilience of China's economic system. American companies found themselves caught in the crossfire, facing higher costs and disrupted operations. Meanwhile, China responded with its own measures, leveraging its vast manufacturing base and state-driven policies to weather the storm. The impact was immediate and far-reaching. Tariffs sent shockwaves worldwide, disrupting businesses from Asia to Europe and the Americas. Consumers faced rising prices, companies struggled to adapt, and entire industries were forced to rethink their strategies. The uncertainty led to falling stock markets, layoffs, and a growing sense of unease among workers and investors alike. The world watched as two economic philosophies collided: American protectionism versus China's state-driven capitalism. Debates raged on television and in boardrooms, with experts and ordinary citizens alike questioning the wisdom of the escalating conflict. Protesters took to the streets demanding action and answers from their leaders. The central question loomed large: could tariffs truly reverse globalization, or would they inflict lasting damage on all involved? As world leaders gathered at tense economic summits, the fate of the global economy hung in the balance, with the outcome of the great tariff gamble of 2025 still uncertain. The Trump administration's America First tariffs were pitched as a way to reclaim economic sovereignty and revive U.S. manufacturing. The logic was simple: make Chinese goods expensive, force companies to buy American, and reduce reliance on a strategic rival. National security concerns fueled the push, especially over critical goods like rare earth minerals. Tariffs became both a negotiating tool and a wall around the U.S. economy, aiming to force China into structural reforms. The gamble that America could withstand the pain, while China would fold first. The first wave of tariffs in early 2025 triggered immediate turmoil, sending shockwaves through the global economy. Overnight, the world's financial centers were gripped by uncertainty. Investors scrambled to make sense of the new reality, as stock markets from New York to London to Shanghai tumbled in unison. The sense of panic was palpable, with news anchors and analysts struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing numbers. U.S. businesses that depended on Chinese imports were hit especially hard. Costs for raw materials and finished goods soared almost instantly, leaving factory managers and business owners scrambling to adapt. Warehouse shelves emptied as shipments were delayed or canceled, and logistics teams worked overtime to find alternative suppliers, often at much higher prices. The intricate web of supply chains, built over decades, began to unravel, exposing just how interconnected and fragile the system had become. In China, the impact was equally severe. Manufacturing hubs that once buzzed with activity slowed to a crawl. Export orders from the U.S. dried up, leaving workers idle and factories facing tough decisions. Shipping containers piled up at ports, waiting for buyers who no longer came. The pain, however, didn't stop at the U.S. and China's borders. Across Southeast Asia, suppliers who provided components to Chinese factories saw their own orders slashed. In Europe, Exporters who relied on stable global trade found their assembly lines stalling, and their products piling up. Freight trucks sat idle, and port activity slowed dramatically. Global markets, already jittery, became even more volatile as investors tried to predict where the next shock would land. The U.S. trade deficit with China did narrow, but not for the reasons policymakers had hoped. Instead of a manufacturing renaissance, what followed was a collapse in trade in both directions. Cargo ships sat docked and empty at major ports, and trade statistics showed a sharp decline. Economists debated the long-term consequences, but one thing was clear: the flow of goods and capital had been severely disrupted. For American farmers, the consequences were immediate and devastating. China, once their biggest market, stopped buying overnight. Crops went unsold, and farmers faced mounting losses. Small business owners, already operating on thin margins, were forced to close their doors. Workers across industries packed up their offices, uncertain about what the future would hold. The ripple effects of the tariffs were felt everywhere. Economists debated fiercely on television while business leaders gathered at conferences searching for answers. Across the world, headlines warned of a new era of economic uncertainty. It became clear to all there would be no easy winners in this trade war. The economic tremor was more than just a temporary shock. It was a warning, a sign that deeper trouble lay ahead, and that the foundations of the global economy were far more fragile than anyone had realized. By the time spring arrived, tensions between the United States and China had reached a boiling point. What began as a series of tit-for-tat tariffs and heated rhetoric now erupted into a full-scale economic confrontation, with both sides digging in for a prolonged battle. The world watched anxiously as the two largest economies on the planet seemed determined to test each other's limits, risking not just their own prosperity, but the stability of global markets. In a move that stunned economists and business leaders alike, the U.S. government imposed a staggering 145% tariff on a wide range of Chinese goods. The message was clear: Washington was willing to endure short-term pain to sever economic ties and inflict maximum pressure on Beijing. The new tariffs hit everything from electronics and machinery to everyday consumer products, sending shockwaves through supply chains and boardrooms across America. China wasted no time in striking back. Beijing announced 125% tariffs on U.S. exports, carefully targeting politically sensitive sectors like agriculture and automobiles. American farmers, already struggling with low prices and uncertain markets, suddenly found themselves cut off from one of their biggest customers. U.S. automakers too faced a steep uphill battle as their vehicles became prohibitively expensive for Chinese consumers. Almost overnight, trade between the two economic giants ground to a near halt. Major ports reported plummeting traffic, with container ships idling offshore and cranes standing still. Business owners, from small manufacturers to multinational corporations, faced existential threats as orders dried up and supply chains unraveled. The uncertainty was palpable, with many left wondering how long they could hold on. While some in Washington celebrated a sharp drop in the trade deficit, the numbers masked a far more troubling reality. The collapse in both imports and exports was not a sign of economic strength, but of deepening malaise. Empty warehouses and unused shipping containers became symbols of a global trading system in distress, while economists pored over data, searching for signs of hope amid the gloom. Investment froze as companies put expansion plans on hold, unsure of what the future would bring. Supply chains that had taken decades to build were suddenly shattered, leaving manufacturers scrambling for alternatives. In boardrooms across both countries, business leaders faced agonizing decisions, paralyzed by the sheer scale of uncertainty and risk. The trade war, once seen as a tool for negotiation, had become a blunt instrument, one that inflicted mounting collateral damage on both sides. Workers in both the US and China faced layoffs and shrinking paychecks, while entire communities struggled to adapt to a new era of economic hardship. As the standoff dragged on, it became clear that there would be no easy winners, only mounting costs and a world left to pick up the pieces. The cost of tariffs quickly hit home for Americans. Prices for everyday goods, from electronics to clothing, rose, straining household budgets. Small businesses, unable to absorb or pass on costs, faced layoffs and closures. Farmers lost access to China, their largest market, and federal aid offered only temporary relief. The manufacturing sector, promised a renaissance, instead struggled with higher costs and supply disruptions. The reality tariffs were hurting the very people they were meant to help. China didn't crumble under pressure, it adapted. Beijing accelerated trade deals with new partners, boosting exports beyond the US. Massive stimulus fueled domestic consumption and investment, cushioning the blow. Chinese manufacturers rerouted goods through third countries, blunting tariff impacts. Companies upgraded to higher-tech production, making themselves indispensable. China also flexed its control over rare earth minerals, reminding the US of its strategic leverage. The message was clear: China was not a passive victim, but a formidable economic rival. The trade war pushed China from defense to offense. State investment poured into high-tech sectors, AI, EVs, semiconductors, accelerating the Made in China 2025 vision. China deepened its energy partnership with Russia, securing cheap oil and gas and strengthening its Eurasian bloc. Rare earth dominance gave Beijing leverage in negotiations, as the US needed these critical materials. While US trade faltered, China's exports to Europe and the developing world surged. Chinese brands like Shein thrived and investment flowed into advanced manufacturing. The result? A more self-reliant, technologically advanced China, less dependent on the US. By summer, the pain was too great to ignore. A temporary truce lowered tariffs, with both sides making tactical concessions. The US allowed some tech exports to China, while China resumed rare earth shipments and eased tariffs. The truce was a ceasefire, not a resolution, an admission that total decoupling was too costly. US officials realized punishing China could backfire, especially with global energy prices at stake. For China, the pause offered breathing room to continue its long-term strategy. Both sides recognized their economies were too intertwined for a clean break. The final tally of the trade war defied expectations. China's economy slowed but adapted, emerging more resilient and less reliant on the US. The US saw higher prices, business disruption, and no manufacturing renaissance. Global alliances shifted, with China strengthening ties to Russia and the developing world. The trade war showed that economic walls hurt those who build them, and that global supply chains spread pain widely. Neither side won, both were left bruised, and the world more fragmented. The lesson: economic confrontation is unpredictable, and its fallout rarely matches its intentions.